Well, what a fortnight it's been. We have a new king, a new prime minister, a new government, and there are still huge challenges facing the country. Tonight we are in Grimsby, once the world's largest fishing port. For over 70 years, Labour dominated here, but in 2019, these people here changed all that and voted in a Conservative MP. Tonight, we are going to be discussing how are we going to pay our energy bills? Should we be overturning the ban on fracking, the NHS, Ukraine, and I promise at the end, we'll look at reasons to be cheerful. Welcome to Question Time. On tonight's panel, we have Government Minister Brendan Clarke-Smith. He was one of the first supporters of Liz Truss in her campaign to become PM. Now a minister at the Cabinet Office, he's been entrusted with the smooth running of government. Labour's Shadow Health Secretary for nearly a year now, who's recently announced he's writing a memoir about his journey from Council House to House of Commons, Wes Streeting. Layla Moran has been an MP for over 5 years and is the first ever of Palestinian descent. She speaks for the Liberal Democrats on foreign affairs. Claire Fox is the director of the free speech think tank Academy of Ideas. She once sat in the European Parliament, a place she wanted the country to leave, and is now a member of the House of Lords, a place she once abolished. Gerard Lyons has long been a leading economist at several major city institutions and is one of the 3 economists who's been advising the new Prime Minister. So, as well as a new king and a new Prime Minister, I thought I'd mention we've got a new set as well. We spruced it up a little bit. You can let us know what you think on social media. I'm sure you will. But just as always, having a fair range of views on this programme is absolutely critical, not only on our panel, but with our studio audience as well. And you know, sitting there, that you've been selected mainly to represent the voting pattern at the last election of the particular nation that we are in. So in England, but also we keep in mind local election results and a sustained change in polling as well. It's very good to have you here. We can't wait to hear what you've got to say. And of course, welcome to you at home as well. Do join in the conversation the usual way on social media at BBC Question Time. Right, let's get started, shall we? Our first question tonight is from Emma Hastings-Bray.
Is the government doing enough to tackle the energy crisis?
What do you think, Emma?
I think that families up and down the country are struggling, regardless of background. And although the government's introduced measures which are helpful, with the fact that everything else is going up, fuel, food, I still think a lot of families will be struggling. OK, Wes?
No, I don't think they're doing enough, frankly, and they've got to do 2 things. One is to grip the crisis in front of us, to give families the help they need to, and businesses the help they need to cope with the rising costs of energy, which are coming on top of rising bills in every other area of life, it feels like, at the moment. And they've also got to make sure that in the longer term, we've got our own energy security, so that we're not reliant on overseas energy, that we're not victims of price shocks that we're seeing as a result of Putin's war in Ukraine. And on both tests, I think the government have fallen well short. Yes, they've finally done what we've called them to do by acting on energy bills, putting in place a price freeze. But look at how they're paying for it, not asking the big oil and gas companies, the big energy producers, to pay more from their excess profits to help the country. They're just slapping it on borrowing, which ends up ultimately you're going to be footing the bill for something that isn't any of our faults. And as for the long term, why is it now, today, we hear the announcement they're resorting to fracking, something that Liz Truss and the Conservatives promised they wouldn't do, something that won't fix Britain's energy crisis, and something that's going to be more expensive than investing in renewables. Let's invest in solar, in wind and in new nuclear and in wind power to make sure that we've got the domestic energy supply we need to keep Britain secure in the longer term.
Is the government doing enough to tackle the energy crisis?
Well, I think we have to bear in mind the package that's just been announced, one of the biggest ever. We're talking about 100 billion. We're looking at trying to get those wholesale prices.
Exactly how much it will be.
Well, this is the point, you see. It could actually be better than that, but at the same time, we're giving.
Could be worse.
Yeah, and this is why we want to give people some certainty. Now, we've been able to do that for 2 years now. Now, of course, those bills are going to go up. It's very difficult for families. We appreciate that. That's why we've also managed to roll back the national insurance increase so far. But I think you also have to look at the other support that we've provided in there. Energy security, yes, I agree with Wes on that. We do need to make sure that we are secure. What I would have liked to have seen, I think, in the past was things such as nuclear being invested in. We've gone from around 6% of our electricity generated by renewables in 2010. Since when we've come into government, within 10 years, that was up to 43%. So we have been doing the right thing, but it's about the energy mix we've got. It's got to be from a number of different sources there. And I think in the past, mistakes have been made. I think at the same time, if we hadn't done what we had done...
Even in the Conservative government since 2010?
Well, I think, again, it's very easy with hindsight to look at it. I'd have liked us to have pushed ahead with new nuclear earlier. We were in coalition for 5 years. There was a bit of a problem with that, and we're now pushing ahead with it. But I look at the situation, say, Germany are in there, very reliant on Russian gas. There's a huge problem there with energy security. With us, we get most of ours from Norway, but at the same time, we have to pay for that. Now, that's the thing that we've put the investment in there, and we hope that at least gives people a bit of certainty, and, of course, for businesses as well.
Well, look, the question is the government doing enough to tackle the energy crisis? We've got people who voted for all the main parties here in the audience. Just out of interest, let's hear from a quick cross-section before we get going. Now, I've spoken to you before, so I know where you are. I'm not sure what you're going to say, though. So, Jackie, over there, you voted Conservative.
Yes.
What do you think to the question? Is the government doing enough?
I don't... They're very good at talking the talk, but by borrowing more money to give us a little bit extra every month does not help the country. By tackling those companies, the British Gas and all those, and to pay for it instead of us paying for it out of our own pocket, because that's what we're basically doing. You're giving it back to us after we've already given it to you. I've just had a pay rise. That's all going to go on my fuel bill. And we're not going to see much more. And, you know, the NHS is struggling. And we were talking about before about, you know, companies struggling. How are we going to pay to keep patients warm when the bills are just going to go through the ceiling?
All right. Now, Laura, that's you over there. And you are a Labour voter. What's your view?
So I'm also a local parent and teacher, and I'm really concerned we're going to see a lot of cold and hungry children this winter. I mean, it's a level of poverty, like Gordon Brown said, that we didn't think existed anymore. The topic of conversation at my baby group, I have a 10-month-old child, is how we're going to keep our home warm, to keep our babies warm this winter. That should not be a topic of conversation in this country, in this day and age.
OK. Matthew, you're a Lib Dem voter, aren't you? So what's your view?
It's kind of a balance, really, that you're looking at two very different sides of the argument, but it's kind of like, where do you kind of go from here and stuff like that?
Do you think enough is being done?
Not particularly to help more disadvantaged families getting from that background. I think there's no explanation of what's going to be provided. That's kind of very common towards universities, and they're maybe not getting the right support or maybe getting the right advice, and that was very common through COVID. So I think a lot more needs to be explained to young people and more to the country about what is going to happen, how it's going to be funded, how we can kind of progress. Well,
in terms of how it's going to be funded, I mean, Gerard, you are one of the 3 economists who has advised the Liz Truss. How is it all going to be funded? Is it enough, and how's it going to be funded?
In answer to Emma's question, are they doing enough? In terms of the first point, I would say yes. We should remember about only 4 or 5 weeks ago, the fear was that energy prices would go up to £4,000 or £5,000. In the city, the expectation was that inflation would go up to 18 or 22% and peak there. By capping energy prices at £2,500, it still is much higher than a year ago. But what the government has effectively done is said, we're going to take the risk off people and off businesses, and we're going to take them onto the government and borrow. Now, so in that respect, they're trying to address the immediate challenge, and by doing this and by reversing planned tax increases, I think they rule out an immediate deep recession that people were fearing 1 or 2 months ago.
I mean, the Bank of England says he thinks we're already in recession.
Well, the Bank of England a couple of weeks ago thought we would have 5 quarters of recession, but that's another issue. The bank,
so do you think they're wrong about that?
No, it's difficult to avoid a downturn, and we probably will have a small technical recession. The challenge, though, is that if we hadn't addressed the energy price cap, then we would have had a real... Okay.
And in terms of the point we're hearing, how are we going to pay for it all?
Yeah, I don't agree with this idea of having a windfall tax as if though that would address the problem. Indeed, companies in the North Sea, not that we have to be friendly to them, but they are taxed at 65%. And the challenge with the windfall tax was it sent a very negative signal by hitting people out of the blue. Whilst the big firms can always cope with it, It's the small, medium-sized firms that are the worry. But we can debate this point. But in terms of borrowing, the issue about borrowing is the government, even though bond yields have risen a lot, borrowing yields are still much lower than the rate of inflation, which is close to 10%. And in my view, the borrowing is necessary to prevent the downturn. It's not inflationary because of the nature of our inflation shock, supply-side factors, poor monetary policy. The question
you
is
might have
whether
to put
it's
some of this
affordable.
in English in terms
But
of supply.
basically,
Gerard, hang on. In terms of supply-side shocks and all the rest of it.
OK, basically, the reason we've had such a hit to inflation is during the pandemic, we had big bottlenecks. We had to pay more for transportation of goods coming here. That's been made worse by the war in Ukraine. So the inflation pressures should start to dissipate. Inflation is now expected, because of the capping of the energy prices, inflation is expected to peak around 11% and then fall next year. So each 1% off inflation saves us £6 billion in borrowing over next year. But the point, coming back to your question, we can't afford, we're not going to escape the fact that we have to borrow more. The question is, who could take the risk? Could businesses take the risk? Could consumers, people take the risk? The answer is no. The government has to take the risk. But what's quite clear from what the audience has said is I think the government needs to communicate it far better. That's what's come out quite clearly tonight.
You convinced, Layla?
No. And Emma, I think that your answer to your own question, I completely agree with, because it's not enough. And my litmus test is the families who contact me as an MP, desperate for help. I was contacted by a single mum. She's on universal credit, 3 kids. She says every day she has to skip meals already. And that's before we even hit winter, and she has to work out how she's going to heat her home.
So
the
would you
same
want to
issue
borrow
with the
even
pensioners.
more, Layla? I mean, because we don't know how much this is going to cost, but it could be 100 billion, some people talking 150 billion. I mean, these are mind-blowing sums. If it's not enough, would the Lib Dems...
Well, the Lib Dems were the first out of the traps to call for the windfall tax. And the reason why that's right to do, first of all, it's really important to make clear, it was on the extra profit. We're not suggesting that you suddenly remove all the profit from them and stop them investing. That's a nonsense. And BP have said themselves they would have invested anyway. They've already made plans for their investment. So this is on the super profits that they're making off the back of this. And it's only right, because this government is about choices. Judge them on their choices. So they've chosen to pass this cost on to you. Meanwhile, they've given a tax cut to big business, particularly the banks. It's going to cost £30 billion over the next 2 years to incorporate their corporation tax cut. That is money. 6 billion of that is going to big banks, and they want to remove the cap on bankers' bonuses. Now, I'm sorry, the way to fix this is not to raise that cap on bankers' bonuses. The way to fix this is to help those people on universal credit who are going to starve, quite literally in some cases, this winter. To govern is to choose, and I think Liz Truss is out of touch and doesn't know what this country needs.
Let's hear some of our audience. The man there in the glasses.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a bit about about the energy prices and the timing of it. I understand that the government have just recently released some energy relief, but in the 6 weeks while they were on recess and the time that they took before that to elect a leader, my energy prices went up from, I run a local company, from £43,000 to £198,000 a year. Yeah. No business can stand that. And the colleagues that I work with, other businesses, during the time that people have been on recess and on holiday and said we can't do anything because we're electing a leader, businesses have had to close their doors. Yeah. And they employ a huge amount of people in this local area. It's not good enough to then come out with, yes, but we're taking the cap off banking, so that's a good thing.
But what about the cap that the government's introducing on energy prices for 6 months for businesses? Does that reassure you?
I don't plan my business 6 months ahead. I plan my business 2 years ahead. 6 months is a sticking plaster. We need some leadership and some definite ideas and some initiatives to make sure that businesses who have just been through hell through COVID, as everybody has, and have survived that, to be faced with this dithering about what we're going to do to save businesses who employ all these people, it's just not good enough. It's not leadership, and we deserve better.
I'm going to come back to you to answer that. Yes, the man at the back.
Just going back to the gentleman's point there, I don't really see how the same old trickle-down economics is going to help the people in towns like Grimsby. We've seen it before where they think this great idea of lowering the tax on big business will then float down to people at the bottom.
And the idea is that everyone there gets richer.
But
it
doesn't work, and it's been proved not to work.
All right, let's hear the man here. Yes.
Well, what I would like to say is, as a disabled person, I'm getting 2 lots of £325 and 2 lots of £150, as well as the £400 off the bills every month that everyone is getting. Now, can you imagine if Labour were in power and were doing this? Everybody would be applauding them, saying, well done, Labour, for helping out the needy. Because it's the Conservatives, everybody is saying, oh, it's not enough. Why don't the Tories do more? So that's my point. And I do think that borrowing is inflationary as well.
And you do think, I'm sorry?
Borrowing money to pay for this is inflationary, there's no doubt about it, but it is going to come down in the new year, which is one good thing.
We hope.
Yeah, we hope.
Claire?
Well, first of all, we've all got to be honest with ourselves and say we're going to face some pretty tough times now, right? There's no point trying to sugarcoat that. And it has to be said that the lockdown policies, which closed down businesses, had a devastating impact for a lot of people. And they were political choices, by the way. That wasn't created by a virus. It was a choice about how we dealt with it. But prior to that, there was problems with the productivity and the economy of this country. So you can't just blame everything on lockdown. I have a lot of sympathy with people who say it's not enough. I mean, I actually am very sympathetic to that campaign that people might have seen called Enough is Enough, which is being run by the trade unions, which is, why should ordinary people pay for political policies that they're not responsible for? So I get that sentiment. But what I really think we need to do now is actually have a mature discussion about how we can get the economy kick-started. I mean, we need a new industrial revolution. And fiddling around with taxes, no disrespect, doesn't seem to me to be adequate to that. I do like the sentiment that's coming from Liz Truss, or, you know, from the Tories about we shouldn't just deal with redistributing a cake that's the same size all the time. We need a bigger cake. We can't just keep fiddling around with what we've got. We need to have growth. That bit I'm very sympathetic to. But that requires major investments in technologies, in new industries. In an area like this, what I'd like to see is a complete rejuvenation of the fishing industry, not to save it, but to rejuvenate it, to kickstart it. But then when we're talking about energy, we should, of course, have fracking. It's disgraceful that Labour and Lib Dems and the Tories have stopped fracking as a means of energy. One of the first speeches I made in the House of Lords, which was on energy, I stood up and argued for fracking, for nuclear, for tidal power, for a revolution in energy so we wouldn't be dependent on overseas energy. And it was the Tory minister and the Labour Party front bench and the Lib Dems who basically treated me like I was some kind of lunatic.
Well,
because they actually were demonising energy.
Well, let's come back to the Tory minister, Claire. Brendan, what about the point that the business... Forgive me, your name is? Mark, that Mark made, the business owner there, that 6 months of capping for businesses is a sticking plaster, and you're planning 2 years ahead.
Well, look at COVID-19, the pandemic there, the support that we gave for that, which was, again, was unprecedented. We didn't know how long that was going to last.
But we're talking about
very difficult. Well, the business support that's been announced is welcome, and I do agree it's one of those things, I think, over the summer that we've had our constituents coming to us and saying we've got to provide something for business. So that is what we've gone ahead and done. On the other gentleman's point...
What do you say to his point that 6 months... You're shaking your head there, Mark. Yeah. What do you say to his point that 6 months, it doesn't give businesses enough certainty?
The government's trying to give as much as they can, but they've also said that they're going to review this actually a lot quicker than that, so we should be able to give businesses more certainty. We also want to see if it works, of course, which is another issue entirely as well. But what I would also say, windfall taxes are being mentioned quite a lot. Now, we've already had an extra tax on the oil companies, and I think some of the figures that have been banded around, we're looking at the global profits of some of these companies. Now, we cannot tax the entire global profits of these companies, and the amount of money that we have to invest to actually cap those prices is far in excess of what we would actually get from that. So we've had to do something extra. That's why we've actually managed to cap for 2 years. Labour are only doing it for 6 months. And in terms of trickle-down economics, we've actually given out money across the board. Everybody gets that £400. £1,200 for the most vulnerable. And on the bankers' bonuses, just finally on that, I think at the time it was introduced, I think everyone was very angry, and when it's public money there, I think you have a right to actually dictate a little bit like that. But what we have to remember is that the base salary of bankers has now gone up instead. They're not being rewarded for their performance, but by lifting that cap, you're actually rewarding good performance. But of course, when people earn more money, they pay more money in tax as well, and we need that revenue. Okay. And we've concentrated on cutting taxes for everybody, and that's why the national insurance...
But Brendan... No, Layla, just hang on one second, because we've got so many questions to get through. If I can, I'm going to try and get through all the ones that we submitted. So will you forgive me? I'm going to move on. Before I do... Wes, you will get a chance to speak in a minute, I promise you. Before I do, I just want to tell you that Question Time is going to be in Manchester next week. And so do come along and be part of that debate. We'd love to see you there. Come and be part of our audience and come and join the conversation. So honestly, I will give you a chance to speak, but I'm going to get to our next question because we have touched on it a couple of times. So I want to get to it before we go any further from Tim. Tim Rosamond, where are you? Off you go.
With North East Lincolnshire a big player in the renewable energy, what are the panel's views on fracking as an alternative energy source?
OK, Layla?
Well, it's the wrong thing to do. But don't take my word for it. Take the head
various people are saying no
take
here.
The head, well, don't take my word for it. Take the head of Quadrilla, which is a fracking company that has tried fracking in the UK and says that the geology isn't good for it. Or take the word of our current Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who back in February said that it wouldn't make any difference to the gas price at all. So take those two things together, and then you think to yourself, all the political capital, all the money that might be invested in fracking, wouldn't it be better to invest instead in renewable energy, funneling jobs into places like the Humber region, also not exacerbating for climate change and our quite right to be sticking to net zero, as difficult as it may be, we absolutely have to. And that's the way we're going to drive the economy of the future. Fracking isn't going to work. Let's invest instead in what is going to work and actually is going to deliver for you as taxpayers.
OK. You were saying no there. Why don't you agree?
Because we have this terrific resource underground and in the seas surrounding the UK of oil and gas. It's the most effective concentrated energy source. If we look at renewables, or unreliables as I prefer to call them, they only work for so much of the day. You will find we go for long periods in this country when, 3-4 days a week even, when there'll be literally no wind. And when we get to this time of year into the winter, the sun doesn't shine. And so you don't have any renewable resource coming through. So you have to have a gas or nuclear backup for that situation. Otherwise, the lights go off. It's very simple. It's simple like that. And this is exactly and going back to what Claire said earlier, yes, we should be exploiting fracking.
So let me ask you, so when you have, because this only came out today, you've got someone who was very senior at Quadrilla, which, as Layla was saying, was one of the first companies to be involved in fracking in Lancashire, who said no sensible investor would take the risk of embarking on large projects here. It's a very different geology to North America. He doesn't think there's any chance of fracking in the UK in the near future. Does that sway you at all?
Well, I haven't seen his statement. Sorry, I haven't seen his statement. But
does that give you pause for thought?
Yeah, I certainly look at it. But from all the other experts in the field whose articles I've read, it's very clear that we can frack, both obviously on land and actually out at sea.
OK. Wes?
I strongly disagree with fracking. I don't think it's safe. I don't think it's cost-effective compared with renewables. Even if we went ahead, I think it would account for something like 1% of the UK's energy mix. So it's a kind of false dawn. What we should be doing, what we should have been doing, frankly, for the last decade or more, is investing in renewables, in solar, in onshore and offshore wind, in tidal power and nuclear, because I take the point nuclear energy has got to be part of the mix. We shouldn't have scrapped all the plans for carbon capture and storage, because then we would have had stored up energy in reserve that would have helped us through the shock that we're currently enduring. And there's a fundamental democratic point here too. Liz Truss, when she became Prime Minister, was elected by a tiny handful of people, Conservative Party members. Now, that's how our political system works, fair enough. But she hasn't gone back to the country to ask for a new mandate for a new policy. And last time I checked, Conservative MPs were elected on manifestos against fracking, and just this morning, the new Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, was calling those people who voted for Conservative MPs Luddites for opposing fracking. I think that's disrespectful. I think it's an insult to the people who voted for them. And worst of all, it's not actually going to deliver the solutions our country needs. Short-termism, whether on the environment or on the economy or on our public services, is doing this country down. It has been doing this country down for more than a decade. And frankly, aren't expecting this lot in the Conservative Party to offer new solutions, new approaches after more than a decade of high taxes, low growth, crumbling public services and a failure to invest is like expecting arsonists to put out the fire they created. It's not going to happen.
So Brendan, just explain what's changed then. You've got the current Chancellor saying, just in March, if we lifted the fracking moratorium, which was introduced by the Conservatives in 2019, it would take up to a decade to extract sufficient volumes. It would come a high cost for local communities. No amount of shale gas would be enough to lower the European price anytime soon. So, is he wrong? What's changed?
Well, first of all, I mean, it was not in the manifesto that we were against it. It was a moratorium on fracking, of course. And since then, we've had a global energy crisis. And, of course, it's understandable that you would want to look at all the options on the table.
But you've got the Chancellor saying very clearly it won't work and it won't make it any cheaper either. So well, he's wrong, is he?
Well, I think this is the crux of it now. You know, we want to see the science, we want to see the environmental side behind it. Now, I speak as somebody who has a large proposed fracking site in my own constituency, so this is something that I've actually dealt with a fair bit. But what we want, as has been mentioned, we want an energy mix. Now, for some communities, they may feel that this is not for them. They may feel that it's not going to bring the price down. They may feel that it's not going to meet their needs. They may have environmental concerns, and the local community will want to decide. And that's what the Prime Minister has said.
Are you backing fracking in your own community? Are you backing fracking in your own constituency? Are you going out knocking on doors saying we're having fracking around here?
No, because I'm very consistent.
Not in your backyard, just in everyone else's.
Well, I'm very consistent on that.
But do you support it?
Unbelievable.
Well, I'm fairly neutral on it. I want to see more evidence. But I'll give another example to Wes's solar farms, for example. Now, in my constituency, there's also 2 very large solar farms. One had permission given to it. There weren't a lot of objections at all to it. And another one where there's a huge number of objections because it's felt that it is in the wrong place. So I think all energy, whatever mix it is, you have to treat it on its merits. And I don't think we're in a position where we can basically say one form of energy generation has to go. Now, we did that with nuclear to our peril, and look at the situation we're in now.
It's an interesting position to find yourself now that you are a government minister, a new one, but you're neutral on a policy that the government is proposing.
Well, no, I think there are areas.
You just said you were.
Well, there are areas of the country where people are calling for fracking. People think it would be very beneficial. People want to explore that, and I think they should be given the option for that.
But Brendan, this argument doesn't stack up, because if this is true, then why is the moratorium on onshore wind not taken away? Why is it OK now to release the moratorium on fracking and not allow communities that might want onshore wind farms to have that? How does this make sense? It doesn't at all. And it just says to me that this has been done on the hoof. Yeah. It's something to announce. What has changed? Actually, nothing at all in the science. It's still a bad idea. We've got a new Prime Minister that needs some, cynically, let's say, new policies to put forward to people.
Well, let's hear from our audience, Haley, because these are the people it's going to affect. Let's hear from you in the front here.
You said Kwasi Kwarteng. He said that it will take 10 years to get sufficient amounts of benefit from fracking.
Well, he said no amount of fracking was going to lower the price.
Yeah, he said it'll take 10 years to get a sufficient amount to actually be usable for us. That's what you just said in a statement just there.
Yeah, to extract sufficient volume. Yes, you're right.
So 10 years' time. So let's do it. And in 10 years' time, we'll have sufficient volume to use it. People like Wes and Layla, sorry, you've just said, I've got your name wrong, sorry. You've just said that you're very similar to people who, like in 2015, like Nick Clegg, said that, let's not do any nuclear because it won't benefit us till 2021 or 2022. And now we didn't do it, and now look at the mess we're in. So why don't we do fracking in 10 years' time, benefit from it?
But if we're going to do fracking, let's also do...
Let me hear a bit more from the audience. Yes, the woman there in the green.
you're sitting in the heart of the Humber energy estuary with the biggest, you know, offshore operations maintenance hub. You've got massive industry along the Humber Bank that want to invest in production of blue and green hydrogen and carbon capture. The government right now has sort of like going back on what it said about supporting renewables. And I think that's worrying for big businesses in the Humber to hear that. They want to know that you're behind them.
OK. And the woman there in the glasses.
I would just like to say I'm 17 years old, and I think by investing in something that is going to harm the environment rather than in investing in something that is going to help the environment, you're not gambling with your own future, you're gambling with my future, because I am the youth. And it's my future that is going to gamble with by doing this is going to harm our environment more than it's going to help us.
OK, and the man in front of you in the check shirt.
It was on energy renewables. The issue with energy renewables is the grid. The grid cannot cope with any more energy renewables, such as wind and solar, going back onto the grid. So the biggest constraint of it, I say, is the grid. So how are you going to invest into the grid?
All right, I'm going to move around, but is there anyone on the panel that can answer that question knowledgeably?
He's right. Yep. He's right. And yes, that is a government choice. They can decide to do that level of investment. It's not going to be easy. But there has been chronic underinvestment in the national grid and in the interconnectors in particular. You're absolutely right about that.
You will have to make it easy if you're going to renew in renewables. If you're going to invest in renewables.
You're right. We hear your point.
Totally agree.
Gerard, since we've got you here, the new Business Secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg, when he was announcing this policy, the lift on fracking, to the House of Commons today, one of the things he said is that the advantage of fracking is by increasing energy supply, it will lower prices. Is that true?
In terms of fracking, I don't think it would have much of an impact. It would be a marginal impact on the price because we're such a small component.
So he's wrong about that?
Well, I don't know. At the margin, obviously, if you increase supply, it has some impact.
But just the marginal one is what you're saying.
The reality is that I'm surprised we're having such a big focus on fracking because in the scale of things, it's quite small. And coming back to Tim's question, should we have fracking? Yes, if it's safe and affordable. What's quite interesting in terms of the debate, we have a debate as if the renewables are competing with other fossil fuels. What's happened in the last few weeks or last 7 months because of the war in Ukraine, we now have to, alongside the move to net zero, have a move towards energy self-sufficiency by 2040. So that's quite important. So therefore, renewables are vitally important. They're up to the end of last year, renewables were 43% of our electricity in the fourth quarter of last year. That's very important. We need to continue with renewables, but at the same time, the mixed energy load is important. Base load for renewables can sometimes be very low, as the gentleman in the front row said. So you can't move from a fossil fuel economy overnight to a renewable economy overnight, but renewables are vitally important. But at the same time, and the reason why fracking has come to the fore is that because of the war, we now need to have energy self-sufficiency. It's in terms of North Sea as well as fracking. It's interesting, a couple of people mentioned the Humber. If you look at recently, private companies in Blythe and in Hull are quite keen to develop the offshore wind. So I think it's a real positive what the UK is doing on renewables, but because of the war in Ukraine, sometimes you have to change plans, and that's important here. But in terms of Jacob Rees-Mogg's point, I think marginally, technically, he might be correct, but I wouldn't argue the point too aggressively.
OK, so it might make a difference, but not so much as we'd noticed. Claire, obviously, you have spoken already in support of fracking, so I'm going to move on if you're happy with that.
No.
No? All right. Well, then, to the young woman over there, you're 17, you said you're gambling with our future. Briefly, try and convince her.
Firstly, you were also very unhappy about that enough was not being done in terms of reducing the cost of living challenges. And let me tell you, if you want to have energy prices that are in any way affordable in the future, you as a young person need to think long term and therefore need to think of a wide range of cheap, affordable energy. And as it happens, that means not demonising fossil fuels. But when
it comes to fracking, Claire, we just heard Gerard saying it might make just a marginal difference.
Yes, but fracking is one part of this. I thought that when people talked about safety, everybody was very keen to quote the Quadrilla people. They actually emphasised that fracking is safe. They said there were technical and geological challenges to what we would get from it from the UK, but they were not anti-fracking. And I think that we've got to be careful of scaremongering. It's also the case that we have to be experimental in the kind of scientific innovation we have in order to create the energy. And then just on democracy, because it's been mentioned, I can't remember, I don't know about you, whether we had a democratic decision about reaching net zero as a target, right? What's happened is net zero has become the kind of we've all got to get to net zero. That's the only thing that counts. And I do think there's a lot of anti-democratic aspects of environmentalism that go against having industrial growth, go against creating
Net zero
jobs.
was in the Labour, Tory and Lib Dem manifesto.
Yes, but in terms of the debate, but it's also the case...
So I feel like people voted for it.
I feel as though
One way or another.
I feel as though what happened was that people, until actually we got to COP26, when people started going, what is this thing? What is it that we are supposed to be targeting? What people say
You're not
is that we should...
I am suggesting people didn't understand what they were voting
I'm
for.
I'm suggesting that there has been a drive to say we use less energy. I'm suggesting that if you want economic renewal, jobs, prosperity, we have to use more energy. And at the moment, we're facing an energy crisis. And closing down any form of new energy, not exploiting it, which is what fracking would do, is foolhardy and short-term. And I think that we shouldn't scaremonger or play NIMBYist games. I think we all have to say that every single possible energy source that can make energy cheap and affordable moving forward is in young people's best interest and will help us counter the recessionary trends that we're seeing at the present time.
A lot of you asked about this next subject. I just want to take another question now from Anne Stebbings. There you are.
Can the ills of the NHS be cured by repeating the first 4 letters of the alphabet?
A, B, C, D, which is the sort of mantra of the new Health Secretary's coffee. You might just want to remind people, Brendan, what that stands for.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, first of all, we've got a
Do you want me to? Do you want me to?
Okay,
You know,
we go through the...
I can tell you.
Yeah, certainly, people's access to a GP is incredibly important. I'm married to a doctor myself. I understand that that's something that we desperately need to get through. There's the backlog as well. There's the recruitment that we need to look at. And we also need to look at bed blocking, which is why we put more money into social care as well and trying to address that problem. So,
shall I just tell people what it stands for? Because you obviously don't know in the nicest possible way. So it's ambulance, A for ambulance, B for backlog, C for care, and then D for 2 things, doctors and dentists.
Yeah, and I've struggled to see a dentist myself, as you can probably tell. But this is the problem. We put huge amounts of money into the health service, and it's about more than money. It's about how we actually use that. So in terms of empowering pharmacists, in terms of making sure people are going to the right part of the NHS at the time. How many people have gone to A&E because they couldn't get a GP appointment, or have basically we've needed to call someone out because social care has not been in place? And these are the kind of things that we need to fix. It's the entire system that actually needs looking at, Fiona.
So the announcement by the Health Secretary today was specifically on a number of things, but in more detail, it was about GPs, announcing a 2-week target for people to be able to see a GP. Is that going to work, Wes?
No, the Royal College of GPs say it won't. The NHS Confederation says it won't.
And I think why won't it work?
Because they haven't got a proper plan to deliver it. They haven't got the doctors to deliver it. And unless you've got a workforce plan for the NHS that delivers more doctors, more nurses, more staff, you don't have a plan for the NHS at all. And since we're doing the Sesame Street approach to government health policy, ambulances, after 12 years of Conservatives being in government, people with heart attack and stroke are waiting on average an hour for an ambulance. B, the backlog is the biggest backlog in the history of the NHS. And don't blame COVID, because it was already at record levels before the pandemic, would have been more than 5 million in spite of the pandemic. C, apparently social care, although last time I checked that began with an S. We've got broken social care in this country, which means 400,000 delayed discharges each month. People well enough to leave a hospital in those beds, which means queues of ambulances out the front. And as for doctors and dentists, well, we've got a dental desert in this country where people simply can't get an NHS dentist. There aren't the doctors, they don't have a plan, and frankly, after 12 years in government, if they don't have a plan now, when is it ever going to materialise? The longer the Conservatives are in power, the longer patients will wait.
OK, lots of hands up. Let's hear you. Down here at the front of the grey shirt.
Surely won't things slightly get better when we get these 20 new hospitals?
40.
Was it 40?
40.
40,
yeah.
yeah.
Do you think it will?
Oh, when we get them, yeah.
The only place they exist is in Boris Johnson's imagination, and he's gone.
All right, the man there in the sort of in the middle at the back with the white shirt and the blue jacket, yes.
Is it now too toxic a subject to be discussed to a sufficient level to be able to tackle the problem? Is the NHS...
Of the NHS, you mean?
Yeah, the NHS, sorry. So is the NHS now, is it too toxic for a politician or even someone in a social situation to turn around and say that there are flaws or issues with the NHS, and therefore that they might need to be looked at objectively and fixed so that for its own betterment?
OK, OK. And let's hear from the man there in the black top there, yes.
Yeah, I want to ask, why are the government removing £12 billion of funding to the NHS tomorrow from reducing the health and social care tax levy? I think it's just... why? You know, when the NHS needs, you know, resources, funding, vacancies, removing £12 billion annually from the budget. I don't understand it. Why is it happening?
OK, Brendan, I will come back to you on that. And let's hear the man here at the back in the grey shirt.
Yeah, I would say that the current government's overseen an absolute disastrous policy in relation to the ambulance services, and terrible, terrible trouble. And to announce this after all this time is just, you know, somewhat crazy in my opinion. But my other point was, how aspirational is it to want to get a GP appointment in a fortnight? Yeah. What sort of vision is that for the future?
So, Gerard, Anne's question is, you know, can the ills of the NHS be cured by repeating these first 4 letters of the alphabet? And also, I just want to direct you to the point that the gentleman made there about, is the NHS a sort of toxic subject? Is it fit for purpose? Are there flaws that should be looked at? I mean, is it a model fit for purpose? I'm just asking you as an economist.
Well, we have shortages of doctors, shortages of nurses, shortages of beds, shortages of diagnostic equipment, and we have unmet demand. So it's clearly facing problems. What I find interesting as an economist is if we had sat round this table 10 or 20 years ago, the argument would have been about more money. What's now quite fascinating is that both this government, the last 12 years, coalition government and Labour government before, we've seen a big increase in spending on the NHS. So now on international comparisons, the spending on the NHS or our health generally now compares. It's America's up the top, then you have Germany, Switzerland, Norway, Austria, next group. But we're in with the rest. So we've now spent a lot more, but yet the problems are still very acute.
So do we need to be funding it differently then?
Well,
is that what you're suggesting?
Well, certainly, if we take doctors, it's quite ridiculous. The Treasury only allows enough money so we train a certain number of doctors. The pay structure in the NHS, the unions seemed... Milburn, when he was the Labour Health Secretary, I think pointed this out. You have this 8x8 matrix, so you can't pay doctors and front office workers more money. You have to pay everyone. So it becomes a complex system. Therefore, you have burnout, attrition. So you need, in my view, to change the funding structure. It comes back to the first debate, actually. Before 2008, the global financial crisis, the British economy doubled in size every 32 years. Since then, our trend rate of growth, it's been the same across Western Europe, has slowed. Now we double in size every 65 years as an economy. Yet our population is growing, healthcare is increasing, new treatments come on, we all want them straight away. So therefore, you need to put more money to it. The only way, in my view, you can do that is to decide to have a hypothecated tax, which the Treasury in Whitehall says no to. The taxpayer, the public, probably would like it. You allocate a certain part of your tax and you know that's going to fund the health system. And on top of that, you have to reform it. You can't say it's one extreme paying, the other extreme no one paying. When you have something that's free at the point of delivery, everyone likes it, but the trouble is it leads to insatiable demand. So coming back to your question, it's about if you decide that you have to go down the route of funding it, we have to find a different way, but at the same time, we have to be realistic. There needs to be some sort of reform as well.
Lynn.
So is ABCD the simplistic answer? I mean, when she came in front of the House and presented this as a plan. I mean, it was a list of failures that the Conservative government has presided over. And we are now in a situation where I had a constituent contact me saying they're waiting 2 months for a GP appointment. And the reason for that is because we are not valuing our workforce. Do you remember when we stood there on the doorsteps clapping for everyone who works for the NHS? And now we are in a situation where this government is absolutely not investing in that workforce. In Grimsby alone, the number of patients per family GP has increased 23% since 2015. This is mirrored up and down the country. The average GP here in Grimsby has 2,700 people on their list. No wonder it takes so long to see a GP. And the answer, I'm afraid, is not reeling off the letters of the alphabet. It is a fundamental rethink by this government about how we value that workforce, how we treasure the NHS. It's a focus on prevention, not just acute care. We don't wait until someone's at their very worst before we help them. It's seeing them soon and nipping those issues in the bud, and it's a focus on things like mental health and public health strategies. And this is a government that now wants to apparently tear away the obesity strategy because that is something that they think is over-regulation. We have to have more vision than this. And I was really disappointed by what Therese Coffey said today, because I think we all deserve so much better than that.
Let's hear more from our audience. The man there in the blue jacket. Yes, the man here at the front in the middle.
Is an example of a broken system where, when phoning up for a dentist appointment, they'll offer you a private one, but they can't offer you an NHS one.
Yeah, you're right. Is that what's happened to you?
That's what happened to me, yeah.
So just tell us about that a minute.
Well, it happened during COVID. It was very difficult to get an appointment anyway because of, obviously, most of the dentists weren't doing as much of the dentistry as normal. But it was about a year ago, I phoned up my normal dentist and they were completely full from that point of view. It was probably 5 or 6 months before getting an appointment anyway. So I tried a different dentist and they could offer me a private appointment in the next sort of 5 weeks, so that was quite delayed. But it was 5 to 6 months before an NHS one could be available. Yet it would be the same dentist that I would have seen the first time I'd been. Can't make any sense, can it? So they have appointments, but only if you're private.
Claire.
I really think that the crisis in the health service goes beyond party politics myself. I think it's very important. The question was asked about whether it's too toxic to discuss the health service and its flaws. But actually, I've noticed that, particularly since lockdown, more and more people are querying whether it was sufficient to just clap the health service workers. Nobody is in any way wanting to be critical of the frontline staff who work their guts out. That's fair enough. But the problem is that there's something with the system that's broken. And lockdown, by the way, actually has made people iller. It's not, I agree with Wes with problems before, but people, you know, you'll know things like this, Wes, but, you know, one of my good friends died of cancer because of problems in terms of timing and lockdown. We know that happened. There are people now who are not going to survive this because of lockdown policies, which all the parties voted for, let's be honest. And what I think is that now is the time that we should be ambitious about having a conversation about what we need to do with the health service. I'm very sympathetic to needing a workforce plan. I think Labour are right to emphasise that. But I also think that there's lots of aspects of the workforce in the NHS that just don't make any sense to me. I mean, it's not just a question of money. Frontline workers, there's not enough of. There's an overabundance of management, it seems to me. It seems that there's a range of... I mean, you know, one of my colleagues is nearly about to give birth, and she's been tracking the terrible horror stories of maternity services. Now, that's not just that they haven't got enough money, because actually a lot of the problems in maternity is that there's almost been some kind of ideological capture of maternity services. They're all obsessed with natural births. They're all on diversity training courses and gender-neutral language so that you say pregnant people and ascribing child their gender at birth and all of this sort of stuff. And I know that sounds glib, but what I'm trying to say is it seems to me that that's a distraction, that actually even where you've got the staff, they're not quite sure, indeed, what their role should be. So I think that we now have to be brave and say that there's something broken in the NHS. An A, B, C, D from the Tories is not going to solve it. And the gentleman who said the idea I should be cheering because I can get a doctor's appointment in 2 weeks' time, I mean, goodness gracious me, that's a disgrace, not a boast.
No, I think you were making the other point, which is actually it's not a sufficiently ambitious target. I think that is the point you were making. I'm going to move on, but before I do, Brendan, do you want to answer this man's point here about about reversing the rise in national insurance, and the money for which was going to go after a certain period to be a social care levy, go to social care? What's going to replace it?
Well, the money's not being taken out, but we're very much about pro-growth in the government, and I think in terms of our philosophy, you're going to see a lot of that going forward.
So you're just going to find it somewhere else?
Well, certainly, I mean, the idea is,
Just borrow a bit more?
Well, the pie is going to be grown, and that's part of the point behind it, but it's about allocating those resources to your actual priorities, and that really is the ABCD part of it.
OK, that's all I was going to ask you, actually, because unless there's something you're burning to say, because I want to get another couple of questions in.
OK, I'll just see if I could, on recruitment, pension rules, we've changed those as well. So we're trying to get a lot of people back into the profession, those doctors, those dentists, with a crazy situation where they didn't want to do it because their pension penalised them. We're changing the rules on that so we can get them back again.
OK, let me take...
10 seconds. The biggest hit to public borrowing would be if we had a deep recession. That's why fixing the energy price cap and reversing these tax increases was important. Even though there's a cost involved in it, the actual cost, if you had a real hit to the economy, is phenomenal. OK. And that needs to be put in perspective.
Graham Keegan, where are you? Yes, we've heard from you before. Let's hear your question.
Does the West have the stomach for the fight now that Putin has threatened to use nuclear weapons?
And I'm not bluffing, Putin says. Claire, do you think he is bluffing?
No, I don't think he's bluffing. I think that this is one of the most serious times in politics, in world history, in our lifetimes. We have a war at the heart of Europe. And it's interesting how it's kind of discombobulated people because, you know, people that I know, my peers on the left, for example, would say that they would be opposed to any Western power that invaded a country, and yet they've kind of panicked when they've seen Russia invade the country, and they're basically saying, well, they're using the Putin line, in fact, that he tries to blame everyone else. You know, this is a war that NATO created, I was forced to do it, and so on. The incredible bravery of the Ukrainian people who have been fighting for their sovereignty, a word I value, I don't know about people in this room, but sovereignty, your own nation, to protect your borders, is something that ordinary people had to give up being students, give up their preoccupations, artists, truck drivers, everyone.
So the question, Claire, is does the West have the stomach for the fight?
So I'm saying that they have got the stomach, but I've actually... two things. I've heard a lot of people be cynical in this country and say, what's the war got to do with us? And I'm saying it's got everything to do with us because it's going to destabilise Europe and because those of us who believe in sovereignty must defend Ukrainian sovereignty.
OK, let me get round the rest of the panel.
But there's
people aren't going to have time to talk.
Quick.
You've got 5 seconds to make it, because I'm going to be strict with you.
There's a proxy war being waged by America, though, which is problematic because it does skew the pitch a bit.
Wes.
And they're using it for their own ends, which I don't appreciate.
Wes, does the West have the stomach?
I don't see the West backing down in the face of Putin's threats, and I also think we need to see his comments...
What, across Europe? You don't see any wavering there?
No, in the context... We've got to see Putin's comments in the context in which they were made. These are not the words of a man speaking from a position of strength. His war in Ukraine has turned out to be a disaster. He isn't meeting his war aims. Russian families are grieving for their dead because they've been sent like lambs to slaughter in an ill-equipped, ill-conceived attack on a sovereign country on European soil. We were right to stand with Ukraine then. We're right to stand with Ukraine now. There will be no capitulation within the NATO alliance. What there does need to be is a hard-headed international effort to de-escalate, to get Putin on the off-ramp, to de-escalate and to withdraw and to accept that we are not going to tolerate the attack on an independent sovereign country on European soil.
Well said.
One of the areas where I don't think there is a paper between the political parties. We stand with Ukraine, Slava Ukraini, and it is absolutely right that we continue to do so. And it's up to the people of Ukraine to decide if and when they want to negotiate. And right now, they absolutely do not. But there is more that we can do as a country to help them. Moscow looks at London and it calls it London grad. The estimate is that we lose £100 billion in this country a year to money laundering. And a lot of that has been Putin's money sloshing around in shell companies washing through the City of London. Now, we started to get a grip of it eventually. I have to say Liz Truss was a bit slow off the mark when she was Foreign Secretary on it, but we got there with the Economic Crime Bill 1. I'm delighted that the Economic Crime Bill 2 is coming back in a few weeks' time. And what that's going to mean, hopefully, with support in the House, is that we will finally be able to get on top of this, because this money, it's not Putin's money he's spending on cars. He is funneling it towards the tanks and his front line, which is directly involved in this war.
Okay.
We can do this uniquely. There is no other country in the world to do it, and I'm glad that we're finally grasping this nettle.
Brendan.
Yeah, I'm glad it's something there's a lot of consensus on, and going on Claire's point, which I thought was a very good one. People have questioned whether we should have the involvement we have, whether we should put the money in. I think 2.3 billion, the latest that's going in, which is a drop in the ocean, really, when you compare it to what we were talking about energy earlier. And, of course, a lot of our energy problems are caused by the behaviour of Vladimir Putin and what he is doing. It's affecting food prices. But, of course, the money is irrelevant. We're doing this because it is the right thing to do. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. And it's about time, you know, people in Eastern Europe, they're worried that they're going to be next. We've shown that we actually stand up to bullies. And I think Vladimir Putin, I think he's now criticising some of his generals, and I think he's panicking. Right. I think he's looking for a way out. But we're certainly not going to back down. I think, as you've seen from the panel, we all stand with the people of Ukraine, and we're here for the long term.
OK. We have got about 2 minutes left, I think, and I just wanted to come to this question because a lot of the things we've been talking about have been pretty grim. So let's hear from Connie. Connie Roberts, where are you? Come on, cheer us all up.
OK, if we're heading into a winter of discontent, what positive changes can we look forward to?
So come on, something positive. Wes?
I knew you were going to come to me first on the comedy question.
Well, it's not comedy. I want to... Oh, look, Connie's outraged you've called it a comedy question.
These questions at the end always get me. I think one thing positive we can look forward to is the fact that seemingly Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, Brendan, other people who voted for the national insurance increase, which we campaigned against, are now seeing the error of their ways and are working out that always going to working people and hiking up their taxes isn't the right answer, especially in a cost of living crisis. And I gather the Chancellor is going to announce a U-turn tomorrow, and I'm sure we will all be cheering him on.
Oh, my goodness. Brendan, 20 seconds each. Come on, something positive to look forward to. It does not have to be political.
Yeah, I've got a newborn who's 2 weeks old today, so back on maternity services.
Goodness.
Thank you.
I was going to say, this is day one of Brendan's paternity leave.
Yes.
He's chosen to come on the programme.
Also, the World Cup's coming up, and, of course, the Conservative Party conference.
Oh. Layla.
We can't wait.
Positive changes to look forward to. It's been a really difficult few years with COVID, and the country has been amazing with it. Last winter and the winter before were just so difficult. I'm looking forward to a Christmas that feels a bit more normal.
Normal Christmas, Gerard?
Well, the last few weeks have highlighted Britain's soft power. The question about the war in Ukraine has highlighted Britain's hard power. We're still a military capability, albeit smaller than the States. I think what we need to do to turn the mood around is to show some economic fight. And I think what's good, regardless of your politics, the reality is that we do need to start focusing on a pro-growth strategy, both in the next 2 years and whoever wins the next election.
Gosh, Gerard, we knew you economists are a jolly bunch. But yes, so the positive change we can look forward to is a pro-growth strategy.
And that means more jobs, higher wages and addressing all these challenges.
We've got about 30 seconds.
We actually had a fantastic show of solidarity and community in relation to the Queen's funeral, and I think we should take heart from that. There's a lot of attacks on free speech that are going on daily, and what's been great is there's a kickback and a fight back against that. PayPal have just been frozen out of the Free Speech Union, and people are up in arms. Well, good. Time to take back control. More democratic debate. Time for ordinary people to say enough is enough. Right. I think it's up to us now.
OK. Right. Our hour is up. Free speech and all. Our hour is up. Our programme is at an end. Thank you very much to the panel for coming. Thank you to the audience. And, of course, thank you to you at home for watching from Grimsby, or Great Grimsby, as lots of you call it here. From Question Time. Bye-bye.